Perhaps one of the biggest twists of the Mandalorian finale was the destruction of the dark saber. After basically spending parts of Season 2 chasing it, parts of the Book of Boba Fett learning about it, and constantly reminded of its importance in Season 3, the mythical item is now officially gone. Crushed by Moff Gideon during his duel with Bo-Katan, it does seem like the Darksaber is out of commission for good. But the destruction of the Darksaber raises a lot of questions, specifically who is now the true ruler of Mandalore? As we all know, the original prophecy/mythology is that only the true wielder of the Darksaber can hold the title of Mandalore. Assuming that the individual won it in rightful combat, the Darksaber would then mark the person's legitimacy as the true ruler of the Mandalorian people. However, given that the Darksaber is now destroyed, all this seems to be called into question. Is Bo-Katan still the rightful ruler of Mandalore, or are we now back to square one? So who is now the rightful ruler of Mandalore? Well, for one, there is an argument to be had that even though the Darksaber was destroyed, what's important about the saber isn't the functional use of it, but rather what it symbolizes. And so, technically speaking, the owner of the Darksaber could never use the saber in combat and still be the ruler of Mandalore. Whoever owns it isn't obliged to use the saber at every given opportunity. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that if they won the saber in combat, they wouldn't ever need to use it. There is nothing that states that you have to use the saber to rule Mandalore, only that you own it. And so by that logic, you don't actually need a functional Darksaber to be the ruler of Mandalore. And if you follow this line of thinking, then in some ways the Darksaber is far from destroyed. Sure, you might not be able to use it anymore, but you can still own it. And I also think that there is an argument to be had that Moff Gideon was quite briefly in the finale the true owner of the blade. Even though he was the one to crush the Darksaber, you can argue that he was the one who defeated Bo-Katan in combat, thereby winning the broken saber. And until Din and Grogu showed up, Gideon with his new suit did beat Bo-Katan. Although to be fair, I could definitely see an argument that points out that Bo-Katan technically didn't yield, give up, or die. And I also think that just by looking at how things played out, you could also argue that Gideon was about to finish the job until he was interrupted by Mando and Grogu, which wouldn't make it a very fair fight and therefore possibly void Bo-Katan's ownership of the Darksaber. So you can see how it gets a little confusing. But let's say for the sake of the argument that Moff Gideon did win the Darksaber from Bo-Katan at that moment. So Mando and Grogu shows up and the three of them essentially tag team Moff Gideon, all of which leads to the Moff getting incinerated by the fire from the crashing light cruiser. And if we assume for a moment that Moff is indeed dead, then the ownership of the saber should technically be passed down to one of the trio. Although, figuring out which one of the three should own the Darksaber is going to be difficult. Quantifying who really beat the Moff is a bit of a tricky situation. But if you go back to the last few moments of the battle, we see Grogu force push Gideon away and then take his staff away from him, before Mando slides in and blasts Gideon, knocking him back before the fire consumes him. And so if we're talking about last hits and the final blow being the one that defeated him, then on the technicality, Mando is back to being the rightful owner of the Darksaber. But then again, on the reverse side, it wasn't Mando or anyone of the trio that caused the explosion. The explosion was caused by Axe Woves, although he didn't know at the time that the explosion would kill Moff Gideon. And so from that perspective, you could argue that Axe is now the rightful owner of the Darksaber. So who should be the rightful owner? And this is perhaps what the entire episode was trying to do, making it rather ambiguous and technical to the point where I think we have to ask ourselves, does it still matter? Whether you consider the Darksaber destroyed or still symbolically useful, or who should rightfully own the Darksaber, perhaps the point to consider is that what if Mandalorian society is better off not answering these questions? What if Mandalorians as a whole are better off without such a relic of the past? You could actually argue that the reason behind so much of the Mandalorians' conflicts and fracturing has been due to this one saber. Because of the mythology behind it, that being only the owner of the saber can be the rightful ruler, Mandalorians have constantly squabbled over it. We can even trace it back all the way to the beginning of the show. The reason why Mandalorians have thus far been unable to unite under one banner has been the absence of the saber as it was in the hands of Gideon, and why Paz and Mando found themselves at odds with each other in the Book of Boba Fett, and why Bo-Katan's forces left her in the first place. And the truth of the matter is is that as much as the Darksaber can be a unifying symbol, it has also been the source of conflict and division. Not only that, but it has provided outsiders a means of enslaving and controlling Mandalorian society. If all it takes is to beat the owner of the blade in combat to become the next ruler, then you'll always have figures like Maul looking for an opportunity to gain power. The Darksaber by itself doesn't exactly promise stable leadership. And so, with the Darksaber now seemingly destroyed and possibly lost, as we're not sure if Bo-Katan managed to recover it in time before the explosion, Mandalorian society has to sort of look inward and reflect. The absence of the Darksaber within Mandalorian society is sort of like a reset button. Without an artifact to dictate who should be the ruler, Mandalorians now have to sort of decide for themselves. In a way, the destruction of the Darksaber has now empowered the Mandalorian people to make their own decisions and decide their own fates. Ironically, this development of events harkens back to the pacifist days of Mandalorian society, where its rulers were not determined by a single blade but rather by the people. And looking at the ending, it doesn't seem like a big deal even to the Mandalorians who initially cared about the Darksaber. In fact, most of them don't seem particularly worried that the artifact is now destroyed. If at all, the absence of the Darksaber has now allowed Mandalorians to develop beyond its past. It's now no longer shackled by the burdens of their ancestors, allowing them to move beyond their history of civil wars. That being said, when we talk about who should be the rightful ruler of Mandalore, I guess it will now be determined by its people. And with Bo-Katan being the obvious favorite, having led the Mandalorians back home, it will most likely be her in power. However, this time cemented not by her possession of the Darksaber, but by the will of the people. Although, another thing to note is that there is the mythosaur which is still lurking about in the living waters, and the question of whether anyone will tame the beast. Let's be honest, we're all really just looking at Grogu here, so who knows until the time comes, the mythosaur might become another symbolic power. Anyways, that's all for this video. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. I'm the Lost Acolyte,
and I have spoken.